Good morning. This is the first of our energy transition webinars. My name is Thomas Nowak. I represent the European Heat Pump Association, and I'm opening this meeting with a tear in my eye because normally we would have been in Brussels and we would have all attended a joint meeting where we would have had the opportunity to talk to each other in person. Unfortunately, that is not possible, but we realized over the time that our messages prevail and we can't stop working and we can't wait until the COVID-19 pandemic has ceased. To the contrary, I think we should use the opportunity that we have with that kind of pandemic and develop further into a renewable and resilient energy system. It's my great pleasure to have two real thought leaders with us today. We are talking with Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome, among many other things that she has done. And her sparring partner and our discussion partner is Mauro, Petriccione, Director General of DG Clima, a very important body in the whole theater of moving our society towards a decarbonized Europe by 2050. And what we could not anticipate, what makes the debate so timely today, is the fact that we are awaiting Ursula von der Leyen announcing the EU recovery plan today at 1 o'clock. So we can spend some time on discussing what we would like to see from these recovery plans for the near future. And we, as an association, we have teamed up with 37 like-minded bodies. We have sent a very early letter asking for a connection between the recovery and the EU Green Deal, making it an EU Green Recovery, which is by now picked up by many other stakeholders and players. And we hope, of course, that we can, by doing so, leapfrog the chasm of fossil fuel investments that we still see happening and move directly to a more green and clean solution. We have two options for, we have one thing that we should say before. If you want to ask questions, both speakers are open to answer them while we proceed. Please use the chat box. If you don't know how the chat box works, you have a small icon on the top right, typically, of the GoToWebinar panel, and there it says chat, and then you can answer, you can add your questions there, but you can also put questions in the question box, and my colleague Sabina, who is with us today, will then check that we don't forget any of these. Without further ado, we would like to start, and I would like to ask Sandrine, in her position as the vice president or the co-president of the Club of Rome, which is a scientist association, scientist organization. What do you think we need from a scientific perspective? And maybe more interestingly also, why is it so difficult to act based on this scientific advice that is pretty prevalent in many news sectors?
Thank you, Thomas, for the opportunity to be on this call, and also it's an honor to be with Mauro. I'm surprised that I'm going first, but I appreciate the fact that you've asked me to. I think from the Club of Rome's perspective, I mean, clearly we've been calling for the last 50 years for a total shift in the way in which we look at consumption. And if you look now at the greatest evidence that we have before us in terms of the convergence of both the biodiversity and the climate crisis, and then now obviously with COVID, which for me is a symptom, right, of those first two. It's a symptom of both the climate and the biodiversity crises, as well as humanity's stepping over the planetary boundaries and forgetting its relationship also with animals, which we see COVID is a zoonotic disease. So I think we have to talk a little bit about pre-COVID and now post-COVID, because I really do believe that post-COVID, there will not be the opportunity or the option to go back to business as usual. What scientists and economists from the Club of Rome have already been saying for many, many years, and what we've just done actually over the last 2 years through our climate emergency plan and now our planetary emergency plan, is to indicate that this is the greatest existential threat. Now, why is it that that's not resonating? I think the science is resonating. I think what's not resonating is the fact that we've got incumbents that are in big business who do not want to let go of power, and obviously some political dimension linked to that in terms of countries who are dependent on some of those incumbents. But I do think post-COVID, and I think we're going to see from the recovery messages that we get today from the leadership of the European Commission and the President herself, that actually there is a growing consciousness that we cannot go back to business as usual. That back to business as usual will not enable us to build back better. And I think that's the message that we now need to ensure that we move forward with. But I'll just put one caveat, is that as environmentalists, as scientists, as economists, as policymakers, if we don't bring people on that journey and ensure a just transition, we're going to never make it, because we'll have more gilets jaunes. And in particular, post-COVID, we have people that are very concerned about their livelihoods, and that needs to be taken care of as well. We can't hear you, Thomas.
Thomas, your audio is gone.
You're on mute.
Yeah. So thank you for that starting opinion. And Mauro, do you think that we are prepared from a legislative perspective to answer to that?
Well, first of all, Thomas, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be here. As you know, I enjoy tremendously to interact with the people who actually do things on the ground and make them happen. And that's certainly the case of the members of your association. So I'm very happy to be here. Look, there are three things I'd like to say. And then the first one dovetails neatly with how Sandrine ended. I usually do my own version of Bill Clinton's trick on it's the economy stupid. Our economy is the source of our problem. We built it in power with fossil fuels. Our economy is the reason why we haven't changed it so far. There was a slogan, Sandrine mentioned the Gilets jaunes. I remember seeing a frightening picture, but I don't remember the exact quote, but the gist was, between the end of the world and the end of the month, we'll worry about the end of the month. And if you ignore that, you're dead. You can't do policy if you ignore that. Yes. We talk about just transition, but we have to be careful not to make the just transition sound like a handout. Don't worry, this will hurt you, but here's the plaster. We have, the economy is our problem. The economy is the reason why it's difficult to change it. The economy is also our solution, because we do have a convergence of environmental, climate-related, human-related, and economic reasons why change is urgent. And once again, Europe is at the forefront. Europe is the place where this is converging, where this is coming together, and it's showing that not only change is possible, but change is necessary, and change addresses a number of things that people want. It addresses a fairer economy. It addresses a more modern and more competitive economy. It addresses a cleaner economy, and it addresses a cleaner environment in which to live. I come from a town which grew up as a steel town. It's now one of the worst environmental disasters on our continent. And it's a place where people have to choose between the right to work and the right to health. And that's not the kind of choice that policymakers ought to give people. For a start, they'll be wiped out. So the economy is key. Now, I think that before this crisis, we were coming to a cost. I think that as if we had labored up a hill and we could see the crest of the hill, and you could just start seeing what was on the other hand, and we were looking forward to passing the crest and rolling down. Now, we know that the way down is long, bumpy, complicated, but it's down. And I think we were almost there. And then this crisis hit, and that's my last point. This crisis hit us, and many of us got extremely worried, because apart from what the crisis itself is doing to us as people, as an economy, as countries, but we were very worried about the natural temptation to say, let's rev things back to the 1st of January. Let's do what we can to make sure this has been just an unpleasant blip in our lives, and rev things back pump money into the economy as we've never done before, to restore things to business as usual, and then we'll restart the transformation from there. That's not what seems to be happening. And it's not only, the Commission was one of the first to say that the recovery had to be green, but we were very surprised by how many people spontaneously came up with the same request, including people you would have expected to want to go back to business as usual as fast as you can. Large industrial sectors, companies with whom we've had the difficult discussion in terms of how quickly they could green their business, who came out saying, look, this is the opportunity, this is the time. We don't want to go back. We want to be helped to get back on our feet, but getting back on our feet means restarting the run where the virus stopped us, not from 3 months before. I think that's extraordinary. I think that's encouraging. Makes me optimistic, but on the other hand, I was born an optimist, and I think I will die one. But that most important, I think that's what you will see in a couple of hours when the recovery package that the Commission is presenting is going to come out. It will try to be a powerful response to this request. We'll have to see then what the member states think about it. But I think there too, we're not out of the woods, so you know the debate as well as I do. But I think the debate is, the positions in the debate are set in a more constructive manner than I had expected. We may also, through this crisis, get out of a situation where we were doing a lot of harm to ourselves in terms of lack of solidarity and lack of cohesion within this union of ours. So, without underestimating the fact that it will be a messy process, a difficult process, and there will be a lot of anger. But I'm quite confident that we're going to get out of this and, as Sandrine said, build back better. Or to quote a colleague of mine, Kerstin Jorna, let's bounce forward rather than back.
And I think it's a very interesting point that you mentioned, that also parties that were typically hesitant, and Sandrine, you mentioned the incumbents that are still resisting, seem to change their mind a little bit. Maybe just being traditional good businessmen in a way of saying, if there is so much money, and if we have said repeatedly that this is too expensive to do this energy transition, why don't we just take these huge amounts of money and make it easy on ourselves to change? Could that be an incentive, that there is so much money out of a sudden at the table that even very resistant people say, okay, before I let this go to another area, I just take it and change my own business model, so in order to be prepared for the future without having to take my own money.
So I think, Thomas, you bring up a really good point. Clearly, the economic situation is such that we've seen the lowest cost per barrel of oil ever. We're in negative numbers. It's cheaper to actually store the oil than actually use it, right? Which for many of us as scientists and economists, all of us have been indicating, well, let's get rid of subsidies. I mean, at least let's do that first. Because I'm always saying it's not just a question of whether the technology is cost effective. Let's ensure as well that the market functions properly in order to stimulate that technology. So the fact that we have perversities in the market, like trillions of dollars that continue to support the fossil fuel industry, get rid of that immediately. Then use that funding in order to enable the social and environmental shift that we actually need. So that would be the first thing I would say to your question. But then the next would be, we now have the cheapest renewable costs we've ever had. In fact, 10 times lower than the IEA and everyone else predicted. So again, yes, you're absolutely right. We should create the shift. It makes sense. It makes sense from a business perspective, but also this shouldn't just be about money. And this comes back to Mauro's point and my point before. Let's not go back to a business as usual approach where growth is the only thing that stimulates our economy. If anything that COVID has shown us, it's that we need to go back to what's essential. This comes back to the original messages of the Club of Rome. Yes, let's shift to new technologies, but let's also look at consumption. Let's look at optimizing our economy so that we're actually servicing people rather than profits first. That's fundamental. This cannot just be a profit motive. Yesterday, I was asked to actually be on a panel with 5 esteemed economists, scientists, talking about Planet of the Humans, which is Michael Moore's film. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's totally a disaster. It demonizes the environmental movement. It demonizes the renewables movement. And it indicates that all it is about big bucks, about money mongering, about corruption, etc. Now, there is corruption everywhere where there is money and greed. And that's why I'm saying in Europe, at least the premise for our shift to climate neutrality and renewables has not been only about profits. Yes, it needs to be profitable, but let's make sure that this is bigger than just shareholder value and profits. It has to be a goal to move towards climate neutrality, and it has to be a goal to build resilience within our economy, so that we don't go back to a 20th century economy that was already broken and bounce back forward, or bounce forward, as Mauro has indicated, to ensure that actually we're building, innovating, optimizing a new economy for people.
This is this comes very nicely that you make that statement, because I have it on my list here to say we hear quite a lot that the European Commission is looking for a new raison d'être. You know, this ad hoc administrative superpower that is often rejected. So last year we saw the Clean Energy for All Europeans package. I think it's repeatedly stated that this is very important. Mauro, do you think we will see today an announcement that also goes into that direction, that shows that there is direct impact from European policy, from European leadership to the end user? And you mentioned Gilets jaunes, so is it even possible to communicate from the Berlaymont to the smallest village in north of Scandinavia?
See, Thomas, the biggest problem the European institutions have is that we were born, we were created, and our mandate is to get real. And that doesn't make you popular, doesn't make you excited, because life is complicated. But that's what we will continue to do. Europe was created as a peace project. Well, that hasn't gone away. You know, 10 years ago, people had stopped wondering, oh, do we still need a peace project? We had war on our doorsteps in the Balkans. Now we don't. Did we fix it? Well, we helped. And the prospect of membership are also one of the elements that keep peace in a difficult region. So that project hasn't gone away. Now, the fact is that if you live in a peaceful society, you also want to live in a prosperous society. And therefore, you know, it's a natural part of our mandate to try and ensure our continent's prosperity. And nowadays, there cannot be prosperity in a world that's hurtling towards climate change. It is going to kill our prosperity first and foremost, even before it kills us. And I think people are realizing that. The Gilets jaunes and that, what they resent is not that argument. What they resent is the shortcut, which says, okay, and we will accelerate this process, and we will tax things, and we will change models of behavior, and all you have to do is to adapt. You know, the Gilets jaunes cannot have been created by 3 cents a liter at the pump. And sorry, I've seen in my lifetime the price of fuel go up 20 times, all taxation.
Yes.
And it hasn't stopped any of us from driving. No, what was true. The problem was the message behind was climate change is a big problem. We're going to fix it, and you're going to adapt, and it's your problem how you adapt. That's what you cannot do.
Let's look at this I think this is a very interesting topic. How do we use taxes? And you are involved in the innovation fund via DG Clima. You have the income of the ETS, which is a couple of billion euros. It will probably be dwarfed by this afternoon's announcement.
You're on mute again.
Well, how is that?
Okay.
How is that? I think
Okay,
I need to.
good. Yeah.
So how is that translated? How is this money from the live fund? So the ETS collects the money. It's available in live. How is that translated back to the people? Do you see a connection there? Can this be made that, from the communications perspective, we are making the use of fossil energy, we are making the emission of CO2 more expensive, and at the same time, we provide it back to those people that are in need, directly or indirectly?
I think the ETS produces a little more than a handful of euros. We're talking about tens of billions of euros a year, most of which goes into the coffers of member states. And all member states, you know, we have a soft encouragement to use at least 50% of their revenue for environmental purposes. In reality, member states spend around 80% of that money for environmental purposes. So there you have almost a closed loop, which worked extremely well. Now, can we target it better? We can. The phase 4 reform invented some instruments in that respect, the Innovation Fund, the Modernization Fund for Eastern Europe, a number of other rebalancing instruments, which are, you know, very technical, very abstruse, and people don't talk a lot about them, but the beneficiary countries talk a lot about those mechanisms so that there are more revenues available to our poorer countries out of the ETS. And we'll do that again in the next reform of the ETS. We started a conversation with member states about should the ETS become a known revenue of the European Union, precisely for the reason you mentioned. You know, this is money collected through a European instrument for the common good. Should we spend that money in the European budget for the common good? That debate is started, and I'm sure that at some point it will happen. So, in terms of creating these links, but this is not. You see, one thing that disturbs me is the whole discussion about mainstreaming climate in budgets. Is an old debate. It's a 20th century debate. The real discussion we should have is, and we're trying to do that, for instance, with the Green Oath in the Green Deal communication, with all the work that's been done by the taxonomy on sustainable finance. No money should be spent for purposes that are contrary to our objective and to the common good. It shouldn't happen. It does happen because, first of all, because we haven't finished the debate on what the common good is. But it's not a question of how much you devote to this little pesky problem of climate change. It's how do you make sure your entire economy shifts and switches. And frankly, you know, that's the business of your members. That's what they're trying to do.
Can we discuss briefly internalization of external effects
of our life, which is heating our houses to a different way of doing it? That's the philosophy.
Yeah, and I would like to connect these two. If I very much agree. I read on the last weekend this very interesting book by the Secretary General of the German Consultation Forum for Environmental Topics for the German government, Maya Göppel. And
she's a member of the Club of Rome, by the way, Thomas, and a good friend of mine. Her book is now rated #1 in Germany.
Yes, and I think it's worthwhile. It is really worthwhile, and I'm still trying to get her into another discussion because I think this message needs to be heard, that there is a change that is requested from all of us, and this is easily said. I think I give her full credit that she also has thought about it a lot and means what she's saying. So I don't want to make it smaller than it is. It's easily said, but the question in the end is how, and I think this reflects very well with you, what you said, Mauro, and also what you said, Sandrine, when it comes to the market, the economy, and the subsidies. How do we internalize the external effects? The ETS works quite well now for the large industry. Maybe there's still some shortcomings when it comes to the amount of pollution rights that are available. But when I look at my sector, and you said, okay, my sector should do that, the heat pump sector should do that, we can heat differently. At the moment, it is still cheaper for the end user to simply replace their fossil boiler with an existing boiler. And that is partly due to subsidies being paid. That is partly due to the fact that the internal effects of using fossil fuels are not paid by the end consumer. Now we see a number of countries that are introducing CO2 price signals, not least Germany has started with a national trading scheme. So my question would be, do you think that this has the potential to be rolled out across Europe, an internalization of external effects for the heating sector specifically?
So I think what you're doing is you're talking about costing externalities, which we've been talking about forever, right? In environmental economics has been focusing actually on costing externalities for years. And you can look at that in terms of both natural capital and the costing of natural capital. And of course, that brings in also the different resources. But I think that we would be wrong to just think that the ETS, a carbon price, and costing externalities without actually shifting our growth model and our indicators to growth, because that is where the perversities start. If you go back to 1968 and a seminal speech by Robert Kennedy, already then, he says, as senator, we must start to put a cost on what we value most. Our economy has never done that. When we only actually cost indicators linked to GDP, then we're not bringing in other indicators. And this has been the real shift in thinking in the last 10 years. If you look at donut economics, for example, that has been promoted by Kate Raworth, which very much looks at the way in which we bring in indicators for our economies, all the way from local economies to national economies, which balance out only and bundle with growth, our traditional growth indicators, right? We could either totally get rid of our growth indicator, or we could actually balance it out by bringing in other indicators, whether it be a happiness indicator, or whether it be a survival indicator, an essential indicator, whether it be an energy indicator in terms of costing externalities and the use of energy. But the fact of the matter is that before, when people looked at Kate's book, they thought, wow, this is exactly where we need to go, but how the hell do we do it? Well, she's just applied it to Amsterdam. And she's now actually working with local governments across the globe to apply a new well-being donut economic model, which brings in other indicators. Now, why is that important? Because it immediately builds in your externalities as costs and starts to internalize those perverse impacts to biodiversity and climate. Clearly, a carbon price is one of those indicators, but it's only one. And our obsession with the carbon price drives me around the bend because, first of all, it's been hijacked by incumbents who say there is no way in hell we're going to be able to transform because the carbon price is not high enough. Well, if you only have a carbon price as the number one indicator for internalizing externalities, you're stuck because you're never going to move forward. You need to bundle other indicators to start to show. And that is why post-COVID, we are now in a totally new world where people realize what is essential. We have actually only looked at shareholder value and put money and profit as our number one indicator of growth. Now we see that actually we haven't even been taking into consideration our economy, care workers, women who actually give to the economy that are not included in the real economy. I think we're really going to start to see a shift. And I think people, and I'll close with that, 90% of the UK population, our dear Brexiteers, when surveyed a couple weeks ago, said they do not want to go back to business as usual. Let's seize this opportunity to ensure that we start to do what's necessary to build an economy that is thriving for people, planet, and prosperity at the same time. Because I agree with Mauro, we need prosperity, but prosperity has to be equitable and it has to bring in both people and planet.
I note down these multiple indicator suggestion. I think that's a very good one, but I still want to go back to the ETS for heating, Mauro, because what I also learned. No, what I learned from the past is it's much easier.
But I mean, I put it this way: I've learned a long time ago that I should not interrupt Sandrine when she gets going. First of all, because it's well worth listening to her, and secondly, it's not a good idea to break her flow. Always wiser to get to the end, and you'll be rewarded. So I would just, biding my time. Look, we're looking at that. The specific point you're making, heating and ETS, we're looking at that. The president has instructed us to look at bringing construction, as she put it in the political guidelines, into the ETS. Well, the obvious channel is heating and cooling. That's very clear. Will we do it? Can we do it? I don't know yet. We're working on that. One thing I can tell you, if things are not in ETS today, there are reasons. It's because it's a bit more complicated than bringing the power sector in. Secondly, one thing is not clear is, and then I rejoin very much what Sandrine was saying, it's not very clear that these instruments can do all the things you want them to do. To give an example where we have already made up our mind, road transport. What we're looking at is, can road transport and ETS help decarbonization of the road transport sector? But we're absolutely persuaded that the ETS cannot replace regulation. So CO2 regulation for cars is going to stay. Now, can we add ETS to that? Does it help? That's what we're looking at. For construction, the issue is much more open, but heating and cooling should be one of the least difficult things to bring into the ETS. The question what we're trying to see is, is it worth it? Does it actually help do the trick? But it won't be enough. Now, without revealing great secrets, because both my own boss, Frans Timmermans, and the president have been saying that publicly, we are now finally taking by the horns the bull of building renovation, which has been, in a way, become, the holy grail of energy efficiency. And we've tampered with this at the margins, many of us in the Commission, in many ways. My conclusion of that is that funding will help. That we have a slight problem with skills, but reskilling workers is perfectly possible. But we have the technologies, we have the materials, we have the techniques, we have the know-how. The reason it doesn't happen is because all the interests are too diffuse, too diverse, too separate from each other. And there's nobody who has a strong selfish interest in aggregating everything together, in aggregating both demand, which is very often scattered, and the different elements of the supply, which belong to this. Why has it worked well for large commercial buildings or for public buildings, through the ecosystem? Because you've had one subject, often the energy companies, who had an interest in taking the long view. Because for energy efficiency, you need to take long view. It makes perfect sense economically, but only if you look at the long view. Now, how many individuals can afford to take that long view? So how do we bring in subjects who have the ability, the interest in taking the long view, in taking the burden of the organization, and how do we support them also financially in doing that? You're going to see a massive initiative on a renovation wave for buildings, and that's going to be across the board. It's insulation, it's changing the way we heat and cool spaces, it's how we change the materials we use and move into materials which are less carbon intensive to produce. and less likely to release carbon when you dismantle it, because the recycling of construction material is a massive problem everywhere, and we don't even know where the stuff ends up most of the time. So what we are trying to do with the taking advantage of the green recovery and of the funds that will be available is do something which we have been struggling with for a while and mulling over for a while, and to which the objection was usually, oh, this is very interesting, it's great, but where is the mass of investment up front that you need to get it going? Well, here we are. Yes. That mass of money is coming at us like a tsunami. If we don't use it, then I think people will be right in asking us some very pointed questions. I would also add that that money is available now, but it's all borrowed. It's not earned yet. It will have to be repaid. There isn't going to be a second wave 10 years down the road. So we go back to the point we were making at the beginning, Thomas. You were spot right. This is the time for businesses and individuals to seize the occasion and do all the things that they wanted to do, and were asking themselves if it was wise to borrow the resources at this point in time. And those who don't do it now will have to do it with their own resources in a few years down the road, because there won't be public support, but there will be regulation. You see, the point is, even if we missed the green recovery, this crisis isn't going to stop the drive to stop climate change. The worst scenario that we must avoid is that it slows it down so that we suffer more damage from climate change than we ought to. That's the worst case scenario, and it could be serious because the climate change damage that's already happening is serious. It's going to get worse, but it's not going to stop. There's not going to be a reversal. So people who play the short-term game now will pay for it in 5-10 years time, and that's why thinking about it, my initial surprise at how much enthusiasm there is in business for a green recovery. At the end of the day, people are looking at their business in the longer term, and they're realizing this is an opportunity they shouldn't miss.
Yeah, can we touch on this financing aspect? Sandrine, you have also worked a lot with big corporations, and I guess you understand the mindset much better. Would you confirm what Mauro just said? Is that something that people eventually realize, and being in a very rational persons in an economic perspective, that if they don't use this public money now, then they have to use their own? And is that maybe even a justification for the Commission and the member states to say we have to make this wave of money that big that even if you're really a little bit hiding under a rock, you cannot not notice that this money is coming, and that you would want to take it now because you risk that you don't want to use your own money later?
So I mean, I would say that the traditional business leader does not want to take public money. Yeah. Most good entrepreneurs don't want public money. They actually want to try to do it themselves. But having just been, I mean, I don't know how many panels I've been on in the last 2 weeks. I just realized it's constant. But the fact is, it's really coming out with some unbelievable conversations. So on Monday, Eurelectric had myself and 5 of the big CEOs, power CEOs. Every single one of those CEOs said the Green Deal needs to be the compass for the recovery. So again, incredible leadership across the power industry. But what they did say as well is our margins are so low. Let's be clear, demand has gone down. Apart from the fact that most people are in their households, where of course electricity demand has gone up in some households, industrial demand, which is the greatest amount of demand, has gone down for energy. And they don't know when it's going to go back up. So the fluctuations, even, and the fact that the price is very low for the moment, so in terms of even renewables, if those are dependent on renewables, or if they're not, on gas, everything is low in terms of the cost of energy. But you need to look at supply-demand dynamics. So even if they're doing all the right things, even if they've created more resilience and started to shift, the fact is they are getting hit because demand has gone so low. And so yes, I would say, from a taxonomy perspective, or from a perspective of sustainable finance and the way in which we're looking at our investment, if the Commission comes out today, which I hear it will, and I commend the Commission for doing that because I feel they've listened and they're really showing leadership, to attach conditions to funding, which will enable those companies that are transitioning and that need the funding now in the power sector, in other sectors, to get that funding to enable them to continue to function as long as they are moving towards decarbonization or already decarbonized, I think is fundamental. And that's what we've built into the taxonomy as well. Let's remember that the taxonomy is the newest framework that we have, which enables the possibility for the investment community and the public sector to compare their investments in projects as to whether they are green or they're not green. So we can assume, because I've also heard that hopefully the Commission will be coming out with a package that also links some of its funding to the taxonomy, which is exactly what the technical expert group called in its letter just a few weeks ago, including myself, saying very clearly, even if we haven't yet adopted this taxonomy, let's use that criteria as a foundational base so that countries and investors know what's green, and the Commission can then make sure that the funding is going in the right direction. I think that is fundamental. But we do, and this comes back to the complexity of the situation we're in. We will need to bail out some companies, unfortunately, that we don't necessarily believe should be bailed out. And in those cases, if we look at the aviation sector, for example, I think it's really important that there are promises that are made by those sectors to transition, and that is where the conditionality steps in. Also from a social perspective, as well as from an environmental perspective. And I'll close with two, I think, really important examples. Aviation sector, France, and some of the ties that have been made to Air France being able to get a bailout package. I think Macron was incredibly brave in indicating that it could not go back to business as usual. And also the elimination of domestic flights where you could actually have train journeys do the same thing. That is fundamental and sends absolutely the right message. Or in Canada, where the oil and gas sector has received bailout package, but the money does not go to shareholders, but saving jobs. And I think these conditions are fundamental as we move forward in order to both ensure that we are protecting people and real jobs, not just companies' bottom lines and shareholder profits, and that we're also ensuring that they're moving towards our objectives of climate neutrality.
This is very interesting. We have a question that relates very nicely to that. Diana Power is saying she thinks that the market mechanism is not adequate, and she asks for regulatory intervention and takes the example of the French car industry. And I have read an economic assessment of that yesterday, which said that what Macron is doing with the French car industry from an economic perspective makes no sense, because the French car industry is not cost efficient in the traditional sense, right? Is not cost efficient to be kept in Europe with batteries and electric and so on. A lot of the value added will probably have to come from China. So now, if I understand you right, you're saying, but in this case, it could make sense to intervene on such a large scale with these strings attached to keep employment and jobs inside Europe and have people employed and give them work.
Hey,
I think Mauro really wants to step in here.
Yeah. I'm sorry, because here you're hitting not only my current job, but my entire career. I spent 30 years doing international trade. Sorry, the notion that you distribute work where it's cheapest is economic, strategic, social, political nonsense. You're going to see the opposite now. When we talk about resilience of our economy now, strategic autonomy, we're talking of the fact that we realized that having very long unidirectional value chains, hits you, and you don't need a major war for that. COVID crisis has been enough to show us. Now, I don't think we're going to see reshoring left, right, and center, but you are going to see a more sober view of where is my long-term interest in having my supply chain. And we're going to see a lot more supply chains brought closer to Europe, a greater diversification of value chain, which is going to be good also for our development policy. So, to say that the car industry in any of our countries is shouldn't be there because it doesn't make sense economically, sorry, that's not true. Without the car industry, we will have a major problem in terms of keeping our entire industrial apparatus working. So if you look at those benefits, it doesn't make sense to let the car industry go out. Now, doesn't mean that we're going to, bail out each and every company who's in trouble. But it does mean that we want to have a regulatory and financial environment that enables European car companies to thrive. And right now, the real question is, we were on the cusp of a change in the kind of mobility that we want. And what we heard consistently from the car manufacturer was, we're ready, we have the technology, we can electrify the whole fleet within 10 years. What is our market? Now, then you get into a chicken and egg situation. Well, where is your market if you keep the prices 25 to 50% higher than a conventional model? And are you investing enough? It could be a very, closed circle, very negative spiral conversation. Now their market has vanished. And the request is, help us rebuild demand, help us give people the confidence to buy a new car. And then, we don't need anything else. We'll pick up. We have the ability to do that. That's what we did in 2008, 2009. It worked. That's what we probably need to do now. But then the question is, which cars? Are we going to miss this opportunity to stimulate the one thing that everybody says is missing and that everybody wants, market demand for clean cars? Are we going to subsidize the purchase of new gas guzzlers or of electric cars and hybrids? That's the kind of key question we need to ask ourselves right now in terms of seizing the opportunity. We're not talking about, big plans and, stratospheric transformation. We're talking about very concrete things. We want to save the car industry. We have to stimulate demand now. It works. It's been demonstrated to work. Which demand are we talking about here? Are we going to spend public money to support public procurement of vehicles? Great, fine. It's the opportunity to electrify buses in our cities and eliminate a major source of pollution. And for a public entity who has the job to take the long view and to bring in not only the economic benefits, but also the health benefits, the environmental benefits of its policies, and the long-term cost of not having an unhealthy population, that's the ideal time to make that kind of long-term calculations when we talk about subsidizing the rebuilding of bus fleets in cities, or supporting, post offices, other organizations who have large fleet of vehicles. You can do that. When it comes to the renovation wave, one point your industry has constantly made to us is, can we have support because we are much better than the alternatives? Well, we are now going to put public resources and public thinking and organization into how do we renovate our building with the objective of using less energy and producing fewer emissions. This is the occasion for those who have the means, the technologies, the ideas to jump in and carve out the space.
I think we are discussing a lot about electricity and transport, but you mentioned really a very important point that I need to stress also as a representative of the heat pump industry. There's not a big difference between an oil boiler in your basement and a truck running in front of your building back and forth, especially if the oil boiler burns in winter when the air exchange is typically slower. So the air quality is affected negatively by burning fossil fuels. And if you say that, well, we can change the demand and we can electrify transport, would it not apply even more to electrifying also heating and cooling? I would like to have an answer for that, but also, Sandrine, if you could keep that in mind from the bigger economics perspective. The heating and cooling sector is typically not in the focus. You spoke to Eurelectric, you didn't speak to heating and cooling CEOs. Maybe they don't have the same weight. Could we?
But we're talking now, right? So that's already a step in the right direction.
CEO. Mauro is not the CEO, so maybe we should have another meeting. But Mauro, first, please. What about this electrification of heating?
Thomas, I contrary to what to Sandrine, I have cut down very severely my appearance in things during this period because I'm using this period to do some of the work that I should normally do, which is thinking of how we can put together a package which will then can explain to you. I've made a few exceptions. This is one of them. It's not by chance. And the reason is that you're absolutely right about an oil boiler and a diesel truck. On the other hand, diesel trucks are easier to replace. It's simply a matter of money. You don't need, well, you need a charging infrastructure, and we're going to spend money on that charging infrastructure. Your business exists in an area where policymakers have found it so far extremely difficult to crack the nut of how do the right things come together. We are determined to give it the biggest try we've ever tried before, to crack the particular nut and bring together all the people who can contribute to a healthier built environment in Europe. Those who work on heating and cooling are bang in the middle of that. You know that we remain attached to technological neutrality. It doesn't mean that we never make choices, but we tend to wait to make choices. On the other hand, we will open the opportunity. It will be possible for anybody who has the technology and the know-how to jump in and carve themselves a space, and we will support that. We support objectives. You've made the point several times that you are those who, your members are those who can fulfill those objectives. Great. Those objectives will be strengthened, supported with public finances. So if what your members tell us is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, here's your chance. I don't want to sound over-optimistic. This remains complicated. Bringing together all the components, you know, changing the heating in a house isn't as simple as changing a vehicle. You don't drive that vehicle in the same way. You may have to do radical restructuring of your house to change the way you heat it. On the other hand, everything is coming together. We've just seen enter into force a regulation which finally bans lead pipes in water. Mm-hmm. How many houses in Europe within 15 years will need to be gutted to replace the water pipes? Now, this may be the opportunity to do it now, and at the same time, do all sorts of other things that you may want to do in your house. Change your heating system altogether. You're taking out your lead pipe, take out your pipes altogether. That's what we're trying to engineer, that a number of reasons for changing the way we live in the built environment come together. We will start, in our view, this will start with public buildings, it will start with schools and hospitals, and God knows whether we've seen that our hospitals need a helping hand. It will continue with large commercial buildings, but we also have to find a way to aggregate individual demand from individual homeowners, and to make sure that the improvements of this renovation don't push up rents and push people out of their houses. So this isn't going to happen in a day, but it needs to start now, and it needs to go on for the next 2-3 years to make a difference, so that this becomes the normal pattern of how you change the built environment in Europe.
Sandrine?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Mauro. I think that we need to look at the renovation wave as, and this is clearly part of the whole Green Deal, as the stimulus for shifting our households, for shifting all our major buildings, for really investing. Clearly, there's a missing trick here, which I often find, and this comes back to the market perversities rather than always looking for new capital. I mean, it's incredible how people and leaders always need to have something new, rather than looking at what's worked in the past. And having worked on the auto oil program, actually, its entire duration, and if I look at what worked the best, when we were told by the oil and gas sector and also told by the automotive sector that it would be totally impossible to shift the entire industry, so both of them, away from high sulfur, no lead fuels and new emission vehicles, right, in 5 to 10 years. There would be huge job losses. It would be the fundamental destruction of both industries. Well, what happened? That tax incentive structure that was actually based on the Scandinavian MK1 and 2 structures that came out actually before to stimulate a shift from polluting fuels into non-polluting fuels. It went so fast, even with the Central and Eastern European countries that were just joining at the time the European Commission or the European Community, that we were able to transition in 5 years from high sulfur fuel, incredibly high sulfur fuel, down to 10 parts per million. I mean, when I go to the pump every day, I look at that and I think to myself, this is what Mauro was saying in the beginning, right? That you guys are the practical guys. And I think, wow, it actually worked. I wrote that legislation. I fill up at the pump. I can see that we're now at 10 ppm. We were told it wouldn't work. That tax incentive structure, because also the value tax that we have on heat, that we have on everything, is a mechanism for us to really start to shift. We have to look at tax incentives and penalties as ways to shift to the market. But as Mauro said, not do what we did and led to the Gilets jaunes, which is all of a sudden hike up the price of a certain good, which is so fundamentally important for the livelihood of people, which then becomes amalgamated with a real livelihood issue, which they were suffering from before, but they just used that particular example as what really brought them down. And I think you wouldn't want that coming from households where they'd be forced to buy new boilers and it would totally destroy their economies, their personal household economies. That's why a tax incentive structure, ensuring that we enable the industry to shift using market mechanisms that help that, procurement as well, is really fundamental. And it's worked, we've seen it work, and we need to go back to those kind of structures.
2 points on this. I think this is really important. Maybe we can use the last 10 minutes on this idea of providing heat not via a product, but as a service. That could also play very nicely into this idea of a circular economy. And maybe looking at blueprints, and you said what we should use, what has worked in the past. I just had an exchange yesterday with a Swiss Department of Energy, and Switzerland has done this very nicely. That could also be an idea for Europe, how to put a burden on the use of fossil energy in heating. They have done that. They have introduced a CO2 price, which is now close to 100 Swiss francs per ton of CO2, which is unprecedented. If you talk to people, I talked to people, the consultant of the Director General in Energy a few years back, and I said to her, you know, if we had a CO2 price signal of 100 euros on a ton of CO2 on oil and gas, the discussion would be over. the efficient electric heating would be cheaper than oil and gas. People would decide in the direction and done with. And of course, then the question is, nobody can afford that. So what the Swiss have done, they introduced this amount of money, and then they redistributed it via the health insurance. 2/3 of the money goes back to the people, into the pockets of the people directly via the health insurance subsidy, and 1/3 goes into projects that are providing financing for people that want to invest into clean technologies. So it's a collection and payback mechanism that honors the ambitious person, and the laggards pay, which nobody has any pity for, right? If you say, well, you could do it, you don't do it, then we are not sorry for you. So would that be something that we could see in Europe? And what about this service economy? Is our industry ready to push really hard into the direction of more services instead of more products? And maybe is it even the time to do this, because we have all this IoT digitalization impacts that we are looking at that could make it much easier to pay for the heat as a service, for cooling as a service, for clean air as a service, and not buy the product anymore. And maybe, Mauro, that could also be helpful for what you mentioned. If I have to redo my whole house and I have to rip out the pipes, why not give that as a job to somebody that is doing everything, and then I pay them off over time?
And who is that somebody? Thomas, you put the finger on the sore spot. Our analysis is the reason it hasn't happened yet is because that somebody is not there for all the renovations we need.
You're right.
Where we've had a subject that was capable of doing that, renovation has happened. The ESCO model is an excellent model, but it doesn't work everywhere. That's what we need to do. We need to bring together all the actors of a renovation. And the renovation wave will consist of many things. There'll be an overall strategy, there will be concrete instruments, there will be financial support. When we launch the Climate Pact after the summer, we will open a platform dedicated to renovation, to bring in all stakeholders, to exchange views, to exchange good practices, and we will work with the Covenant of Mayors to bring in local administrators. Because if you want to launch a massive renovation wave, you also have to look at the urbanization. Moving into a more service-oriented economy, you tell us. We see that as the trend, but you are those who have to make it happen. If you come up with the right services that fulfill the policy objective that people are asking us to set, you will be supported. Now, on the example of Switzerland, the fact is that Switzerland doesn't apply that to industry. On the industry, they have an ETS, which is now linked with ours, so the price will be aligned on ours. Much of Swiss industry isn't in Switzerland. It's on our territory, so it's a bit easier if you've shifted your pollution somewhere else. Whether it's a carbon price or is a tax or anything, that's not the point. The point, back to the basic economic point, somebody ought to pay for the effects of fossil fuel consumption, and it shouldn't be people's health and the environment. We go back to that. We will reopen the Energy Taxation Directive. That decision has been taken. I cannot tell you in what direction, but next year, as part of the Commission, will present a very, very large legislative package next year. And it's all black and white. You can find it in the political guidelines of the President, you can find it in the Green Deal communication. We are on track for that. COVID or no COVID, we're still on track for that. The timetable is hellishly short, so things may always go wrong at some point. But we are finishing the first part of the impact assessment, and then we will move on to the more refined part and the drafting of legislation. So by this autumn, we will come public with what legislation we think needs to be changed. but the Energy Taxation Directive is one of them. Now, will member states, with the unanimity to which they remain extremely attached, be willing to have a serious conversation about redirecting energy taxes? And will they then play their game? Because if you look at electricity, the problem with it is not so much the actual tax on electricity, is that the electricity bills are a convenient means to pile up all sorts of charges that you would like people to pay, and that people will have to pay anyway because they're charges related to something else. But the fact that they come on the electricity bill discourages the use of electricity. Are member states willing to shift that model? We will open that debate, and we will need a serious discussion and an intervention by all stakeholders to make sure that we try and get it right this time. Because our taxation system, and you know, I don't believe in the pure action of the market. Nor do I believe in the ability of government to replace the market. Being in government and doing exactly that, looking at what works and what doesn't work in terms of market and regulations across the world, to believe in any of those two extremes. But the fact is, our current balance between the market and the regulation isn't right. It's not right for the objectives we want to achieve. So we have to change it.
Sandrine said we need more, we need better indicators, and now you said something very interesting. I hear at least that you said there must be some regulation between markets and between governments, which is probably everybody. So if everybody acts in a certain direction based on a certain indicator, we could come out of this crisis more strong and more resilient and more future-proof. So maybe as the last question to you, because we are coming to the end, Sandrine, what would you think is a good indicator for this to encourage correct behavior or future-proof behavior? And how would that match with Mauro's skepticism between 100% markets and 100% government, or fit?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're going to come back to economic indicators, I would move more towards well-being and actually essential indicators. So refocusing the economy on what's essential for people to also feel comfortable within the economy in terms of resilience and building up for the next crises. So in order to do that, you need to reevaluate your growth model. And let's be very clear. The 20th century model that we had pre-COVID, we had the highest suicide rates we've ever seen. We have the highest amount of mental breakdown that we've ever seen. We have the first generation that's making less than the previous generation. So don't tell me that that economic model is actually bringing growth to most people, okay? So even if you're a growth guru and you think growth is the only thing, then I can already dispute that whatever we had before didn't do that either. So the model was broken. But coming back to your very specific point, which what does this mean for the heat and cooling pump industry? I think we need to make sure as we move forward to have a proper balance, and I agree with Mauro on this, between regulation and the market. The United States, and again, I'll come back to this renewables film and Planet of the Humans, which by the way has been taken off YouTube because they actually didn't follow copyright laws. And probably they're going to get all kinds of other things thrown at them because they actually used wrong data. But the fact of the matter is it's very clear from that model that the lack of regulation within the US and the push only for market mechanisms, and in particular for market gain, has meant that the system is totally disconnected from any objectives whatsoever in moving towards decarbonization and also bringing people on the journey. So it's just become a huge money-making enterprise. The difference here in Europe is that the investment community has the signals it now needs from the European Commission, from member states, that we are moving towards renewables because of climate neutrality. But we need to look at a variety of tools in the toolbox. There are no quick fixes. So in your particular industry, I agree with Mauro. Let's look at the renovation wave. Let's look at how we actually stimulate a shift that helps and enables people to make that shift within their households, that looks at the real estate industry and works with, by the way, the real estate industry is going to be in deep problems post-COVID, because we're never going to go back to offices the way we did before. So there is going to have to be a total reshifting of the way in which we use space. And I think that needs to be integrated into the approach of both using the full toolbox of tax incentives and shifting the market with regulation, as well as ensuring that people are then enabled to be able to make those choices, and that they realize these are the right choices for their health, as well as for the community at large and the global planet, in order to reduce our emissions.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very good closing remark. Mauro, what about this afternoon? What do you expect? What would be the best thing to hear when you hear the announcement of the recovery package from your perspective?
I don't know. The debate within the Commission has been rather intense, but I'm pretty confident that we will produce something that can do the trick. We have no claim to perfection, but the real discussion is going to be in 3 weeks' time, when this hits the European Council. Then I want to see whether our member states put their money where their mouth is. That's the real thing. Because look, when it comes to power generation, we are on the right track, and we're going extremely fast in that direction. We have all we need. We have to pursue it. We have not to abandon. We need to support, to avoid that this crisis stops investment in power generation. That's a strategic, would be a strategic mistake we would pay very dearly within 10 years. So that's an industry that's not doing too badly, in spite of the problem that Sandrine described earlier. They're doing less badly than others, but that's not a reason to ignore them. That's the first point. Secondly, industry, again, we have to avoid that this stops what they were doing. Last year, in 2019, we grew by 1.4%, which by European standard these days is nothing to complain about. We reduced emission by 8.7%, 2% by industry. First time it happened under the ETS. So, and transport emission were growing. So our industry has also taken the right path. We have to make sure that it doesn't stop, and we will have the problem, as Sandrine identified earlier. A lot of people have run out of cash. A lot of people will have trouble in staying open. We knew already that we had a number of components of every sector which were more fragile than others. That fragility has multiplied. So there is another issue where we must avoid that this crisis breaks what was emerging as a good pattern. And the third point, the renovation wave, the mobility, but also agriculture, the sectors which were difficult to decarbonize, this is our opportunity to break the back of the particular beast and put those sectors on the right pattern. The ETS, with all its criticism, has worked extremely well in terms of putting people on the right path. This is a transformation. This is not a revolution. This will take 30 years. But 30 years is not that long, says he, having spent 33 years in one job. I can tell you, it goes very fast. Frighteningly so. But we must avoid breaking those patterns, and we must build similar patterns where we have failed to do that. Now, I think we are in times of crisis. Our economy needs help, our workers need help, our society needs help. The package that's going to come out today is designed to kickstart that help, to add to what member states are doing, and to try and smooth out the asymmetries. to re-establish the fundamental solidarity that we need within the European Union. If we do that, then I think we are on a very good path, and I'm encouraged by the fact that most of the people I talk to have come spontaneously to the conclusion that the path they were embarking on earlier is still the right one. Can we help them stay on it? I think that's the objective of today, and I think what the Commission will propose will do that. You know, no doubt we will argue until we are blue in the face about details of this or that program, but I think that package will do that trick. And I have no doubt that the Parliament, again, after criticizing every bit of it, will be in favor of such a package. Will we get consensus among member states to go? And then again, the question is not the direction of travel. Is everybody prepared to jump as fast as we think they ought to now? Not tomorrow, now. And that's going to be a very, very interesting conversation.
Very nice. I could really continue, and I think I hope the audience has had as much pleasure as me in listening to the two of you. Very insightful thoughts. I leave this this conversation with a very good sense of optimism and with the strong belief that if the connection between the recovery funds and the Green New Deal is maintained, and I take it from you that you believe also that this is going to happen, then we are on a good track and we continue. And maybe we will see new indicators, Sandrine, I really hope so. And we will see a strong and powerful recovery that helps the climate and helps us as humans in the end. So thank you very much for this morning. And I wish you all the best for the continuation of your work. Mauro, I hope that you could do another 30 years. It seems that you're at the right point.
Yeah.
And for Sandrine,
everybody needs a break.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break now. Thank you very much again, and have a good rest of the morning.
Thank you both.
Thank you for talking to you.
Take care. Bye-bye.